Hollywood's golden age shimmered with elegance, glamour, and men who seemed carved from myth. On screen, they rescued damsels, whispered tender promises, and embodied the kind of masculinity America worshipped. But behind closed doors, far from the glow of studio lights, a different reality ruled, one built on fear, violence, and carefully protected secrets. These leading men, adored by millions, carried tempers that shattered marriages, spirits, and sometimes even lives. And the most chilling part is not that these acts happened, but that an entire system worked tirelessly to hide them. Studios paid police to stay quiet. Publicists rewrote injuries into accidents. Doctors were pressured into silence. Newspapers received phone calls reminding them which stars were too valuable to expose. For decades, Hollywood taught America how to fall in love, while privately nurturing men who brought terror into their own homes. Their wives lived in shadows, navigating rage, intimidation, and emotional destruction, while the world outside celebrated the men who harmed them. Today, we pull back the curtain on the icons whose true legacies were built not on charm or talent, but on the suffering that fame allowed them to conceal. These are the stories Hollywood never wanted you to hear. To the public, Wallace Beery embodied the gruff but tender-hearted everyman, an on-screen father figure whose rough exterior always softened into warmth by the final act. Audiences adored him. MGM banked on him. He won an Academy Award, headlined some of the studio's most successful productions, and cultivated the persona of a lovable oaf whose bark was bigger than his bite. But behind the cameras, Beery's bark was real, and his bite was devastating. Those who knew him privately insisted that the gruffness was no act, it was the truest part of him. And for at least one woman, it was life-altering. Gloria Swanson, one of early Hollywood's brightest stars, married Beery before either of their careers had fully exploded. What followed was a short, brutal marriage she later described with a mixture of horror and disbelief. In her autobiography, Swanson recounts a night that still shocks Hollywood historians. Beery, infuriated and drunk, punched her in the stomach with enough force to cause a miscarriage. She lay bleeding and terrified while he walked away without remorse. No studio intervened, no police were called, and no newspaper printed a word. The silence was not an accident, it was a cover-up. MGM knew they possessed a lucrative star and acted accordingly. Beery was temporarily sent away on a rest trip after another incident, one involving a young actor who later died from injuries sustained in a fight where Beery was allegedly involved. The studio buried the police report so deeply that even today, researchers struggle to piece together the full truth. MGM's priority was not justice, but protecting their asset. Every scandal could be bought off, every witness silenced, every trail erased. And there were witnesses. Crew members described Beery as a bully, especially toward those without power. He berated women, mocked extras, and picked physical fights with men smaller than him. A long-standing rumor claims that at least one studio employee attempted to come forward about Beery's violence, only to be paid and threatened into silence. Even decades later, former staff refused to speak about him on record, suggesting a culture of fear that outlived the man himself. Swanson's account, delivered more than 60 years later when Beery was long dead, remains the most damning piece of testimony, not because it was sensational, but because she had nothing left to gain by telling it. Her quiet endurance and decades of silence reflect the larger truth of early Hollywood. Women were expected to survive, not speak. Errol Flynn was the Golden Age's ultimate adventure hero, the man who moved with impossible confidence, swung from ship masts with acrobatic ease, and smiled with the sort of effortless charm that made entire theaters melt. To audiences, he was courage personified. But the legend crafted for the screen bore little resemblance to the man navigating life outside the studio gates. Behind the fame, Flynn cultivated a lifestyle defined by excess. Alcohol, parties, and a relentless hunger for attention created an unstable foundation for every relationship he entered. His first 2 marriages quickly deteriorated under the strain of unpredictable behavior and emotional volatility. Those close to him described a cycle familiar in Hollywood's troubled private lives. Moments of disarming charisma followed by abrupt mood swings, jealous confrontations, and destructive impulses intensified by heavy drinking. His third wife, Patrice Wymore, entered the marriage hopeful, only to witness the same patterns that had unraveled the first 2. The most public fracture in Flynn's image came in 1942, when he was charged with misconduct involving 2 teenage girls. The accusations sparked one of early Hollywood's most sensational trials. Flynn denied wrongdoing, and a jury eventually acquitted him, but the trial exposed details of a personal life far removed from his screen persona. Witness testimonies and party accounts described an atmosphere where boundaries were blurred and power dynamics complicated everything around him. Even as the court reached its verdict, the proceedings carved a permanent fissure in Flynn's reputation. Warner Bros. Moved swiftly to shield him. Private investigators were hired, publicists coordinated narratives, and legal teams worked to control every headline. The studio needed Flynn, the face of their most profitable adventure films, and they mobilized accordingly. Reporters who attempted to dig deeper found doors closed, phones unanswered, and sources suddenly unwilling to talk. In Hollywood's machinery, financial value often outweighed moral inquiry. Flynn's later years only deepened the contradiction between legend and reality. His health declined rapidly under the weight of alcohol and lifestyle excess. Close friends noted that even as his body weakened, he leaned harder into the reckless persona that had both elevated and destroyed him. The charm never fully faded, it simply coexisted with instability. By the time he died at age 50, the myth and the man had become inseparable. Fans remembered the swashbuckler in tights. Insiders remembered someone far more complicated, brilliant, erratic, magnetic, and deeply flawed. To post-war America, Bing Crosby was the embodiment of warmth. His mellow baritone soothed millions. His Christmas specials defined nostalgia, and his cardigan-clad gentleness made him everyone's ideal father. But behind the carefully curated image of calm domesticity was a household ruled not by kindness, but by fear. Crosby's children, especially in Gary Crosby's explosive memoir Going My Own Way, described a home where affection was scarce, discipline was sadistic, and their mother lived in a constant state of quiet dread. Crosby believed in breaking a child's spirit early, and he carried out this philosophy with chilling precision. He used belts, paddles, and a custom switch reinforced with steel pellets to maximize pain while minimizing marks. The children were weighed weekly. Any gain was punished. Gary wrote that they lived not in a home, but in a regime. Their mother, Dixie Lee, offered no protection, not because she didn't care, but because she too was terrified. Already battling insecurity and illness, Dixie turned increasingly to alcohol, numbing herself against a marriage where her own voice held no weight. Hollywood insiders had whispered for years about Crosby's explosive temper and need for total control, but Paramount Pictures had invested too much in his wholesome brand to risk exposure. Publicists crafted narratives of the perfect family man, even as the real family disintegrated behind closed doors. The contrast between public projection and private violence was so stark that when Gary's memoir was published, many refused to believe it until 2 of his brothers confirmed every word. A third brother spiraled into depression and alcohol abuse, dying by suicide. Another followed the same tragic path. The echoes of Crosby's cruelty stretched far beyond childhood. Dixie's story is equally haunting. Though never publicly accusing Crosby of physical abuse, she lived and died in the shadow of his dominance. Some accounts claim Crosby didn't visit her during her final hospitalization, a detail that mirrors the emotional distance that defined their marriage. After Dixie's death, Crosby's second family painted a far gentler portrait of him, suggesting he mellowed with age. But even if true, it does nothing to erase the damage inflicted on the first. Crosby's legacy remains a cultural paradox, a man whose voice symbolized comfort and peace, yet whose household was marked by terror, broken spirits, and silent suffering.
Frank Sinatra's could melt a room. Smooth, intimate, and impossibly romantic, it carried the promise of tenderness to millions of listeners. His songs painted him as the consummate lover, passionate, wounded, irresistible. Yet the women who actually lived with him knew a different Sinatra, one whose charm could evaporate in seconds, replaced by a rage so explosive that even Hollywood's most powerful studios feared its consequences. Sinatra's first wife, Nancy Barbato, endured the earliest tremors of his temper as fame magnified his volatility. Friends spoke of sudden tirades, door-slamming arguments, and nights when Sinatra stormed through their home like a man possessed. Nancy rarely spoke publicly about physical violence, but her silences, combined with her later admissions that Frank was impossible, painted a portrait of a wife walking on emotional minefields, trying to anticipate the next eruption. But it was Ava Gardner, the woman who matched Sinatra in fire and fame, who revealed how violent the storms could become. Gardner, never one to sugarcoat her past, later stated simply, "He hit me." Though she emphasized it wasn't frequent, the fact that it happened at all between two of Hollywood's biggest stars speaks volumes. Their marriage was a battleground of jealousy, insecurity, and alcohol-fueled rage on both sides, but the imbalance of power was undeniable. Sinatra's association with organized crime added an unspoken threat to every confrontation. No matter how heated the fight became, Gardner knew exactly how protected he was. Sinatra's temper didn't confine itself to his partners. Hotel rooms were smashed, phones ripped from walls, tables overturned in drunken fits of frustration or jealousy. There are documented incidents where police were called to calm domestic disputes, only for the reports to vanish hours later. Studios intervened immediately, not to protect victims, but to protect their star. Sinatra was too valuable, too iconic, too profitable to ever be held accountable. His later marriages, to Mia Farrow and Barbara Marx, showed fewer signs of physical aggression, but the emotional volatility remained. Sinatra's anger could still fill a room, and his talent for turning affection into intimidation remained intact. Farrow once recalled how quickly his demeanor could shift, how suffocating his disapproval felt. To the public, Sinatra was the soundtrack of romance. To those who lived with him, romance often came with conditions: absolute loyalty, unquestioned devotion, and endurance through the storms. John Barrymore entered Hollywood as the great tragedian, the man whose profile alone seemed sculpted for the stage, whose voice and presence carried the authority of theatrical royalty. But as the decades progressed, the brilliance that once defined him slowly dissolved under the weight of alcohol, exhaustion, and an unraveling personal life. What remained was a figure haunted by his own legend and increasingly volatile behind the walls of his home. By the mid-1930s, Barrymore's dependence on alcohol had become impossible to hide. Studio handlers regularly arranged for doctors to administer stimulants to help him work, and directors sometimes shot scenes around his physical instability. The decline was not sudden. It was a long, painful descent marked by inconsistency, mood swings, and eruptions of frustration when he felt his talent slipping away. That tension became most pronounced in his fourth marriage, to actress Elaine Barry, who witnessed the full force of his deteriorating self-control.
Elaine later described episodes where arguments escalated into destructive outbursts, furniture overturned, objects smashed, and nights spent waiting for him to exhaust the storm of emotions he could no longer regulate. Though she rarely framed these accounts with dramatic language, the picture she drew was unmistakable. A household ruled by unpredictability, where her primary instinct became self-protection rather than partnership. Earlier wives, including Dolores Costello, left the marriage quietly, but for similar reasons. The man they loved was gradually being eclipsed by the man shaped by addiction. Hollywood enabled the cycle. Barrymore's status as artistic royalty made studios reluctant to intervene in ways that might threaten his reputation. As long as he could still deliver flashes of brilliance on screen, the system absorbed the chaos around him. By his final years, however, even that brilliance faltered, leaving behind a portrait of a man fighting battles he could no longer win. Robert Mitchum built a career on effortless cool, half-lidded eyes, unshakable confidence, and a presence that made danger look seductive. In films, he moved like a man immune to fear, embodying the type of masculine mystique audiences couldn't resist. But the persona that made him iconic often reflected the turbulence he carried off screen, where alcohol, impulsiveness, and emotional volatility shaped the rhythm of his private life. Mitchum's marriage to Dorothy Mitchum lasted nearly 6 decades, a rare feat in Hollywood. Yet longevity does not always equal serenity. Those close to the couple described an ongoing struggle beneath the surface. Nights when Mitchum's drinking transformed him from quiet introspection into explosive confrontation. Arguments flared quickly, doors slammed, voices rose, and tension seeped into the walls of their home. Dorothy remained steadfastly private, never offering public accusations, but her silence often spoke louder than any interview. Hollywood insiders observed the patterns from a distance. Mitchum had multiple run-ins with law enforcement, especially involving alcohol, and bar fights were almost a part of his public mythology. By the time he was arrested on a high-profile marijuana charge in 1948, his bad boy reputation had become both reality and branding. Studios found a way to turn his volatility into marketable mystique, reinforcing the image of a rebellious outsider while concealing the emotional cost behind closed doors. Friends later remarked that Mitchum seemed at war with himself, a man capable of deep loyalty and humor, yet equally capable of sudden shifts that left those around him unsettled. Dorothy's role became one of quiet endurance, managing the unpredictable rhythms of a partner whose charisma was matched only by his instability. Through it all, she kept the details private, perhaps out of generational expectation, perhaps out of love, or perhaps because speaking openly would have forced her to confront what she had learned to survive. Rex Harrison built his screen persona on effortless sophistication, precise diction, elegant posture, and a cool detachment that made him the definitive English gentleman of Hollywood. But behind the polished exterior was a far more complicated man, whose relationships were marked by emotional distance and quiet manipulation rather than warmth. His involvement with actress Carol Landis became one of Hollywood's most controversial tragedies. Landis was reportedly devastated after a private confrontation with Harrison the night before her death. When he discovered her unresponsive the next morning, his first call was not to emergency services, but to studio representatives. He was never implicated in wrongdoing, but the decision reflected priorities that would shadow his reputation. Image first, everything else second. Another defining chapter unfolded in his marriage to Kay Kendall. Harrison learned early on that Kendall had a terminal illness, yet agreed with doctors to keep the diagnosis from her. Friends later recalled how the secrecy gave Harrison subtle control over the emotional landscape of their final years together. It was a form of dominance exercised quietly, through information withheld rather than overt confrontation. Across multiple marriages, similar patterns surfaced. Former partners described him as emotionally dismissive, quick with cutting remarks, and skilled at maintaining control through poise rather than volatility. His charm was real, but so was the coldness beneath it. Spencer Tracy was revered as one of Hollywood's most gifted actors, an artist whose quiet intensity and moral gravity made every role feel authentic. Audiences saw integrity, steadiness, and a rare emotional depth. But the qualities that defined his screen persona clashed sharply with the turmoil he carried privately, much of it fueled by lifelong struggles with alcoholism and guilt. Tracy's early years in Hollywood were marked by episodes of heavy drinking that disrupted both his work and his marriage. His wife, Louise, remained legally tied to him for life, but they separated early, friends quietly acknowledging that his unpredictable behavior made the relationship unsustainable. Tracy's Catholic upbringing compounded the emotional strain. He refused to divorce, yet could not sustain the stability a marriage required. His decades-long partnership with Katharine Hepburn offered him companionship, but it also revealed the darker edges of his private life. Hepburn spoke carefully in public, but in private conversations with friends, she acknowledged the emotional tension she endured when Tracy drank. She described walking on eggshells, sensing how quickly his mood could turn, and learning how to adapt her own behavior to avoid escalation. It was a relationship shaped as much by caretaking as by romance. MGM protected him fiercely. Studios rearranged schedules, shielded incidents from the press, and quietly sent Tracy to rest clinics when his drinking spiraled. His talent made him indispensable, and that status insulated him from public scrutiny. Those closest to him carried the consequences instead, navigating a man whose moments of brilliance alternated with periods of volatility and self-loathing. By the end of his life, Tracy remained a revered figure to the public, a symbol of dignified masculinity. But those who knew him understood the cost of that facade, the emotional weight he placed on partners, and the private storms overshadowing the performances that made him legendary. To television audiences, Desi Arnaz was the charming, exasperated Ricky Ricardo, the devoted husband who danced, joked, and played the straight man to Lucille Ball's mischief. Their chemistry helped define the American sitcom, and viewers embraced them as an idealized couple. But behind the iconic laughter and applause lay a marriage strained by infidelity, alcohol, and emotional volatility. Arnaz's rapid rise to fame intensified habits he had long struggled with: heavy drinking, late nights, and a pattern of romantic entanglements outside the marriage created mounting tension at home. Friends close to the couple recalled arguments that escalated quickly when Arnaz felt cornered or confronted. His temper, particularly when fueled by alcohol, often resulted in shouting matches and moments where objects, not people, bore the brunt of his frustration. While Lucille Ball never publicly accused him of harming her, she acknowledged in private moments that certain nights left her feeling unsafe or overwhelmed. Complicating matters was their shared business empire. I Love Lucy and Desilu Productions tied their professional fortunes together, making separation both emotionally and financially fraught. Ball shouldered the dual burden of preserving her public image and managing the unpredictable climate at home. She once confided to a friend that she never knew which Desi she would face at the end of the day. Hollywood worked hard to maintain the illusion of America's favorite couple. Publicists framed their tensions as charming cultural differences rather than signs of deeper strain. When the marriage finally ended, the public narrative emphasized incompatible lifestyles, not the emotional toll behind closed doors. George Sanders built a career on elegant cynicism. With his velvet voice, aristocratic poise, and razor-sharp delivery, he became Hollywood's most iconic villain. The man whose insults were delivered with such precision they felt like a form of art. But the same wit that entertained millions often cut far deeper in his private life. Sanders's relationships were marked not by volatility, but by a steady, corrosive stream of criticism and emotional distance. Former partners, including actress Zsa Zsa Gabor, described a man who could dismantle confidence with a single remark. His comments were rarely shouted. Instead, they were delivered quietly, almost politely, yet designed to wound. It was a form of control that left no marks, but left lasting impact. Gabor later wrote that living with Sanders meant navigating a constant exercise in emotional endurance, never knowing when the next dismissal, comparison, or exquisitely crafted insult would arrive. His sophistication made the cruelty harder to name. To outsiders, it looked like dry humor, but to those closest, it felt like psychological erosion. His later marriages were similarly brief and strained. Several partners left citing mental cruelty, a phrase rarely used publicly at the time, yet repeatedly attached to Sanders. As his career slowed and his personal struggles deepened, the emotional barriers he built grew even higher. Sanders ended his life in 1972, leaving behind a note that captured the detachment he lived with, a final expression of the same cool distance that shaped his relationships. James Mason carried a quiet intensity that made him unforgettable on screen. His voice, smooth, deliberate, almost hypnotic, gave even the simplest line a sense of depth. Audiences admired the sophistication, the restraint, the intelligence he projected. Yet in his private life, that same restraint often manifested as a different form of power, emotional distance so sharp it became its own form of domination. Mason's marriage to Pamela Mason, which lasted more than 2 decades, gradually revealed the underside of that controlled exterior. In her memoir, she wrote not of explosive arguments, but of constant, subtle undermining. Comments phrased as reasoned observations, decisions made unilaterally, and an atmosphere where her needs felt negotiable, but his felt absolute. It was not aggression, it was erosion, slow and deliberate. Friends who spent time with the couple described a relationship shaped by imbalance. Mason handled finances, social circles, and household decisions with a quiet authority that left little room for equal partnership. Pamela, increasingly isolated, would later admit that she spent years trying to interpret his expectations, adjusting herself to avoid the chill of his disapproval. Hollywood rarely recognized these dynamics as harmful at the time. Without visible conflict, studios saw nothing to intervene in. Yet Pamela's accounts made clear that the absence of shouting did not equal peace. The stories of these 11 men reveal a truth Hollywood spent decades burying. Behind the shimmering posters, behind the elegant tuxedos and carefully posed smiles, lived people whose fame shielded them from consequences, whose reputations mattered more to the industry than the lives of the women beside them. Some were volatile, some calculating, some quietly corrosive, but all benefited from a system designed to protect the star, not the spouse. Studios rewrote narratives, softened scandals, and turned trauma into footnotes. And the public, mesmerized by charisma and performance, embraced the illusions without ever seeing the cost. What remains today is not just a record of individual failings, but a portrait of an entire era that normalized silence. Many of these women endured alone, knowing the world would choose to believe the man on the screen, not the one behind the door. Their stories remind us that brilliance and cruelty can coexist, and that adoration can conceal profound darkness. As time passes, the myths fade, and the truth grows clearer. The golden age was never as golden as it looked. The real Hollywood was built not only on talent, but on secrets, sacrifices, and suffering hidden in the shadows. This is the Hollywood they never wanted remembered.